So I don't think I need to give you much introduction. What I found on your website is that you were born in Vermont and you thought about becoming an engineer briefly, perhaps. I don't know.
Yep.
But you've been an artist. You went to art school, as we were just saying, with Leo in college.
Yep.
And when was your first graphic novel published?
So the first one that was traditionally published by a real publisher was 2005, I think. But I self-published several books starting in 1998. I'll talk a little more about that.
2005 was such a big year for graphic novels. So many things happened around that time.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, wow. So Garrett's been doing it for a really long time, and you're really known for adaptations, but you take them way, way above and beyond what sometimes people think of when they think of adaptations. So I'm not going to say too much, Gareth, because I know you said you have a whole presentation, so I'll let you show us what you got.
Okay, cool, awesome. I am going to share my screen here for a bit. And should I go straight through, or did you want to break it up at all?
Well, I don't mind if you guys, if you have a question at any point as we go along, you can either like interrupt by unmuting yourself, or you can say something in the chat. I'll try to pay attention to the chat.
Cool.
But if nobody interrupts you, Gareth, then we'll just do Q&A at the end.
Okay, awesome. That's my website, which I was talking about before. And what I like to do is jump in and explain sort of how I got to be a graphic novelist, how did I know that's what I want to do, that kind of stuff. And that starts, with some of my early drawing projects. I've been drawing ever since I could hold a crayon, a marker, whatever. And when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I started to draw all the time. My mom would, she stopped buying me sketchbooks and started making me these ones out of scrap paper with a wallpaper sample for a cover tied together with string. And instead of filling them with random unrelated sketches, I filled each one with a single picture story. And this is my favorite one because I made myself the hero of a fantasy epic. And also, this was one of the early ones. And I knew from reading picture books that I wanted each page to have an image and some text on it, but I didn't want to figure out exactly what the words were going to be or how to spell them. And so I just wrote, "I do not want to write at all." And then on the next page, the adventure continues and it says, "I will not write anything." And it goes on like that for about 25 pages. So, in a way, you could draw a straight line from that to what I'm doing now, right? I really was interested in the drawing and the visual storytelling and not so much in the writing necessarily. But of course, there were many twists and turns along the way as well. In middle school was when I started to draw actual comics with panels and speech balloons and sound effects and so on. And then I did a strip that ran every week in my high school newspaper for 2 years. So that was my first experience with long form storytelling, with being published, with getting feedback, having deadlines, all that good stuff. I got to experience that a little bit in high school. Also here, you can see I was doing editorial illustration for the school newspaper. And I really enjoyed that. And I knew like the golden age illustrators, a lot of them were primarily editorial. And so when I went off to art school, I was initially thinking I'd become an editorial illustrator. This is one of my magazine illustrations for a class. The title of this was Sex and Smell. And also book covers I knew were an outlet for illustration, and I liked to read. So I did a lot of, for a lot of my portfolio classes, I would do book cover paintings like this one for Dune, which I don't have to explain to students anymore. I used to have to explain what this was. Now they all know, like, oh yeah, that movie. But I kept coming back to comics. And in my senior year, I picked a thesis project to work on that became my first graphic novel. And it was a comic adaptation of this Brothers Grimm fairy tale called Bearskin. And I actually sort of chose this because I wanted to be able to focus on the illustration. I didn't want to spend the entire semester writing. And this story is only about 2 pages long in its original form. So I thought, maybe 20 or 30 pages in comics. And then by sort of like really letting the pictures tell a lot of the story and having long wordless sequences, this ended up ballooning into an 80-page graphic novel. So that was my first book. And I took this around to some publishers. I didn't get that much interest, but I learned about self-publishing. And then I learned about the Xeric grant, which back in the day was like the one grant you could apply for that was started by one of the guys from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I got that. So I joined this sort of little niche who's who of like people who got started with the Xeric grant. And the cool thing about starting out self-publishing is you learn about all the different parts of the process. So, how a book gets made, how it gets into stores, all that kind of stuff. And I took that knowledge and I decided to do a more ambitious book. And I liked the idea of continuing to adapt. And I wanted something that connected classic literature to the modern superhero genre, which is why I chose Beowulf, because I think of him as one of our early superheroes. And I wanted to treat this kind of like a superhero comic, but also in a much more serious way in terms of the way I was presenting the art. And I did it as a 3-issue miniseries that I self-published. And then each issue was based on one of the monsters that Beowulf fights. He fights this monster Grendel, and then Grendel's mother, and then the fire-breathing dragon. And I actually, you can see I'm experimenting with materials with every book, and in this case with every issue. And I'm always just wanting to try different things, different effects, different emotional effects that I can get with different materials. So I gathered these 3 issues together in a single graphic novel. I started to sell this. I started to go to, or I tried going to an English teachers convention. And suddenly it was night and day from when I had been going to comics conventions, where people were like, oh, that's pretty interesting. That's kind of cool. At the English teacher shows, they were just like, oh my God, I need this. This was a tool that they were so excited to have for introducing kids to the classics. And so that really started to take off. And that was also how I came to the attention of Candlewick Press, who reissued this and has done all my classic adaptations going forward. That is their cover. So then I'm going to just kind of fly through the next few. I decided to try some Shakespeare. I did King Lear. I was just picking my favorites. These are probably not the most strategic choices. I did The Merchant of Venice. Again, each time there's like a different look, sort of a different visual experiment that I'm trying. And then I felt like, okay, I had a couple of books under my belt. I was ready to try the Odyssey, which was my favorite of the classics growing up. And I kind of had this sense that the Odyssey would maybe like be really successful, like maybe my most successful book. And that turned out to be true. So all the work that I put into this was like a 2-year project, telling the story of the travels of Odysseus. That all, really has paid off with this book being my most successful one. It also got me this gig, which was illustrating a picture book about Greek and Roman mythology. That was kind of fun. And then I went back to Shakespeare. I did Romeo and Juliet, which is maybe the one I should have started with, his most popular book. And then Macbeth, his darkest, creepiest play. And then based on my publisher, this is the one time really that my publisher has asked me for something specific. And it wasn't that specific, but they said, oh, we really like this dark, creepy stuff. Like, can you do a horror book? And I was like, sure, I can do Edgar Allan Poe. So I did a collection of Poe stories and poems. And I also got hired to illustrate a nonfiction book about one of Japan's most famous samurai. This one's not a graphic novel, just a series of brush and ink illustrations. And that came out of a conversation with the editor, because we found out that we were both really interested in Japanese martial arts and Japanese history. And there's a theme that I'll probably hit again. It's just like these random connections. It's, as they always say, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And then I was, at that point, felt like I was finally ready to do the companion book to the Odyssey. And I knew that this was going to be even harder. It's so much more complicated, but it also has been pretty successful. So those are the 2 books I'm probably best known for, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And then the other thing I just want to talk about briefly is this other job that I had. When I was getting started and I was self-publishing, I knew that I was going to need some other form of income, because self-publishing is mostly money out, maybe a little bit in. And I ended up stumbling into a job working in video games. And it may be that some people here are interested in that job, or maybe I've even worked in that industry. I worked in the game industry for over 10 years. And these are most of the titles that I worked on. I was doing things like character design, designing costumes and weapons and settings, filling up sketchbooks with these little sketches, and then some more finished illustrations that would show what a moment of the gameplay might look like. Production art would include things like character portraits, 2-dimensional backgrounds, which would be painted usually in Photoshop. 3-dimensional characters, which would be created using something like 3D Studio Max or Maya. And you can see here the white lines show you the polygons that this character is made up. And then this is the texture map that gets wrapped around those polygons. So for those who don't know, basically everything in video games is made out of polygons, and it's all just mathematical abstraction, and you wrap these texture maps around it to make it seem like it's solid and real. Nowadays, you can kind of sculpt these models in a more intuitive way using something like Mudbox or ZBrush. I never really got to do that much for professional game projects, but I did use those tools a little bit sometimes to sculpt heads of my characters. So this is a head that I sculpted for Romeo for reference. And then I also did some rigging, which is basically the process of attaching an animating skeleton to the model that you want to then play those animations. And then you drop them into a 3D world made out of polygons with texture maps over it, add some physics so that they bounce off of things, have them play those animations as they run around. And you basically create this illusion of a physical three-dimensional space, even though it's all just, these mathematical abstractions. This, incidentally, is a shot from a game that I worked on for over 2 years called The Lost, which I was really excited about. It was based on Dante's Inferno, and I did all these cool character designs for it. And then that game got axed, it got canceled. And so that was one of the reasons I knew I wanted to eventually get out of the game industry, was because a lot of my work got thrown away in one way or another, not always as radically as this, but so when I was working at a studio that was doing the handheld games for the Pixar movies, and I was building 3D environments. Like this was for the Pixar's Ratatouille for the Nintendo DS, the rooftops of Paris. Here, during that time was when I started to have some success with Beowulf, and I got this 2-book contract with Candlewick Press. And at that point, I had to make a decision, and I had the opportunity to go and do books full time. Which is always hard for kids that I talk to understand, but you guys probably all are in the same boat, where it was like books were really my first love and what I wanted to do. And then the way that Graceling came about is, again, it was a matter of knowing people. I met the author Kristin Cashore at a conference years and years ago when we were both sort of just getting started. And we really liked each other. We really liked each other's books. This book was very, very popular, young adult fantasy novel, came out about 12 years ago. And she's done a lot of great books since, but none of them were as action oriented as this book. So we knew that a lot of her fans were sort of still kind of waiting for to sort of experience that world again, in a exciting, action-oriented story. And so the theory behind this was that I would enjoy adapting it, and that it would be attractive to both her existing fan base and my existing fan base, and maybe bring each other bigger audiences. It was also very popular overseas, and so far it hasn't been optioned for foreign rights, but that is also has some potential. So let's see, for those who don't know, I'll just show you the first couple of pages of Graceling and tell you the setup. It's about this sort of fantasy world where there's no magic, but some characters have sort of special powers, and you sort of know somebody as a Graceling, which is what they call those people, if they have 2 different color eyes. And our main character is this young woman, Katsa, who has a combat grace. So we meet her sort of breaking into this castle dungeon and knocking out all the guards. In order to rescue this one guy. We don't really know who that is until later. We get some backstory on her grace. And then as she's running through the garden, she gets sort of attacked from behind. She flips this guy over her shoulder, she realizes when he lands very lightly that, oh, he is also graced with some kind of combat skill. And then that is the beginning of this sort of interesting adversarial relationship that later turns romantic. Slight spoiler there. So anyway, it's a really cool story. I had a ton of fun illustrating this. I'll talk more about the process of the materials that I used for this particular book, but I just want to show you a couple of my favorite pages. I really loved doing the landscapes in this book. There's a lot of them traveling around different parts of the countryside, and I especially love the sort of mountainous landscapes on this. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a super rough overview of my process. It changes with every book. So this is not, the gospel, but basically outline, script, concept art, designing all the characters, etc. Thumbnails or rough layout or sketch dummy, whatever you want to call it. Basically the entire book in rough sketches with text. That's the stage where hopefully you do most of the editing, get feedback from the editor and other early readers before you do the line art, coloring, the sound effects, the speech balloons, all that stuff. that goes on top. And normally I'm working from these existing ancient texts, and often they're not even in English or modern English. So I'll read a whole bunch of different translations, and then I'll kind of rewrite it in my own words. I create an outline, which is really just a way of thinking about the overall structure of the story and what's going to sort of take up the most pages, or where can I cut more material. I find that I have to cut out quite a bit of material to get these things down to the length for a graphic novel, even though my adaptations are longer than, you know, a lot of the ones that were coming out. You know, when I started this, there was just Classics Illustrated and a few other random examples, and they were all really short. So part of my thing was to give these more breathing room, but I still had to cut out a lot of material. And at the same time, I'm starting to sketch the characters and think about the historical period, do research into that historical period, you know, think about, you know, what would like authentic Viking weapons and armor look like on my characters, creating a script. And nowadays I like to use Microsoft Words. You know, you can sort of like style the chapter names so that you can collapse it to an outline. So my outline and my script are now one document. And you can see that, I just want to point out, I don't know if you can read these, but there's numbers next to each chapter, and those are word counts, because I'm trying to keep track of where I'm using the most words, and also then think about which ones I need to shorten. So the ones that have highlights or that are already crossed out are things that I think that I need to cut down more. And in fact, the first draft of this was way, way too long. I showed it to Kristin, and she really liked it. And she said things like, this was my chapter summary. And she was like, I adore these summaries. They keep cracking me up. She was really fun to work with, and she was really appreciating what I was doing. But this was the target length was 50 pages, and this was page 133 on that draft. So I knew I needed to cut this down a lot more. Also, this was 36,000 words compared to my Iliad script was 30,000 words. So I had kind of walked into this project a little bit overconfident about how much I was going to be able to cut down this novel, because the story seemed pretty straightforward to me. But then the modern novel is just more intricately constructed, I think, than the epic poem, if you will. And so yeah, I had to cut out still a lot more from this script, but I started to basically do that when I got into the drawings. So here are some of the early sketches, thinking about the characters, thinking about sort of historical influences. It's not Earth, it's not a particular historical period in this case, but just taking inspiration from different times and cultures, starting to hone in on some of the characters, how I wanted them to look, starting to hone in on the style and the materials that I wanted to use. So this was like 2 different color samples for this one character sketch. Starting to sort of group them together and show them to other people, getting feedback, drawing additional facial angles for the ones that I liked, drawing a sort of a model sheet, which became the sort of official reference for the costumes, both for me as I was drawing them, and also for this book, for the first time, really, I hired a coloring assistant. So I had a flatter named Frank Reynoso who was doing all the flat colors, and this was his reference to color the characters consistently throughout the book. And then we have some more of my little concepts in watercolor. I really like the idea of having some of the book be like looser and more watercolory. And so I really liked this particular watercolor piece. And I ended up redrawing this page to have more detail on it, but I kind of used that as a touchstone when I was drawing some of the later landscapes and things to have them feel a little bit looser like this. And then I'm just going to demo very quickly how I do my rough sketches. So I'm working on it, on a Cintiq here that's off to the side. I also do some of this on tablet PC, and I like to use Adobe InDesign for this, which is kind of crazy. It's not really a drawing program, but there is this freehand pencil tool that sort of leaves there's like a light blue line that snaps to a black line. I don't know if you can see that, but and there's a couple reasons I like this tool. The first reason is actually because it's not very good. These drawings are like fine for the rough sketches, but the line that it gives is is on the one hand very dead, right? It's all the same line width. And on the other hand, it's very bumpy and squiggly and weird. So that reminds me to stay loose and to work quickly. But then also it's vector art. And so I can take these lines and I can like adjust them or, move them around a little bit. And then I can group them into a character who I can move around, I can squash, I can stretch. So there are some downsides to using this program for this. The files get very large and sometimes they get a little buggy. But what I love about it is the fluidity with which I can play around with the images and the text at the same time. Adjusting the size of the text box, dragging things off to the side and trying other things, so trying out, different shots, like maybe a 2-shot here. Just trying to, of course, figure out, you guys know all about this, basically just figuring out what I want to focus on, whose face is important, whose expression is important, is the body language more important, or the setting, all that kind of stuff. So I take those rough sketches, show them to my editor, show them to some early readers. It'll look something like this. This is one of the spreads from the Odyssey. And then I like to use some traditional materials for the finish. I don't like it to be all digital, partly just because the look, and also because I don't want to be drawing with plastic on plastic or plastic on glass 8 hours a day, all year long. So for the Odyssey, I did pencil and watercolor for the finished art. And then I scan those paintings, drop them back into the layout, add the speech balloons and the borders digitally on top. And, I've definitely been criticized for having these be so clean and so sort of meta. They really sit on top of the art. Personally, it doesn't bother me. It never bothered my editor. But I have played around in other books with trying to integrate them more using different ways of drawing the balloons, et cetera. So let me go back to here. And I'll just show you for Graceling specifically how I adapted this process. So this again is the Adobe InDesign rough layout. For some of the pages, you can see lots of stuff that I've dragged off to the side, especially once you get into like action scenes. There's like tons and tons of stuff that doesn't get used because I'm trying to like choreograph like not only what are the moves, but what are the camera angles and all that good stuff. And then I'll lighten up those lines and use that to draw over in any of a number of different programs. I actually found now the brushes are good enough that I could use Procreate, I can use Photoshop, I can use Clip Studio. I can basically like combine drawings from different media. And in fact, this one at the bottom is brush and ink. So some of the close-ups I actually drew with a brush because I wanted the line to be thicker, but also more alive than what I was getting from the digital tools. And then these are the flat colors that I got back from the flatter. And then I did very, very simple watercolor painting for each page, just kind of blocking in the background and then simple shadows on the characters. Combine that with my flat color, add a watercolor texture over the top of everything, and then add my speech balloons and my panel borders on top of that. And I was pretty happy with how this came out in terms of like it's crisper than it would be if I was doing just pure watercolor. And it also allowed me to offload some of the work. And it still basically looks like watercolor. The flatter found this to be more difficult than he predicted. So I'm gonna have to pay him more next time or find somebody who's willing to, put in some really long days. But aside from that, this process went pretty well. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing there. Actually, there's one more thing I want to show you guys. This is not really part of my presentation, but I think it will interest you. Let's see, let's go back in here, and I want to show you my Onenote notebook. So I like to keep myself organized using Microsoft OneNote, which allows me to kind of like keep it synced between my computers. And so I have a schedule, and the schedule is pretty basic, but it's important because it's how you, or at least for me, it's how I figure out what delivery date is realistic. When can I actually deliver the book? And then as I'm going along, I can tell when I'm falling behind. I can tell exactly how far off the rails I'm going. So This book went pretty far off the rails. Usually I'm able to deliver like within a month of when I said at the beginning. But here I actually had to reset the schedule twice, both because the book was supposed to be 200 pages and ended up being 270. And then also because coronavirus hit. And then also just, general other life stuff that happened. So these red things are my notes about exactly how far I am behind. And, I still delivered within a couple of days of the twice revised delivery date. And the nice thing is the publishers are actually they're very understanding about dates slipping, because most writers, and this is the other thing, if you're writing your own stuff, you don't really know how long it's going to take. You can't predict it as well as you can predict the illustration. And so, they're used to things being late, but if I can tell them exactly how late it's going to be, like 4 months in advance, they're way happier about that, like way happier. And of course, it's good to keep track of how badly I'm doing on my schedule, because that also determines when I'm going to get paid for a delivery. So that's important. Also in here, besides my schedule, I have a whole big list of edits that I want to make based on drawings that I don't like or comments that I get from my early readers. So these are just the edits to the rough layout. These are edits to the line art, right? These are long lists of little tiny tweaks. Some of these take 10 minutes and some of them take an hour, but they're most of them are closer to the 10-minute side, luckily. But it's things like, somebody's likeness isn't quite right, or their costume is a little bit wrong. And then this is also where I gather my photo reference. OneNote, it's very easy to like paste stuff into OneNote from the web. Sometimes I am using like my own, let's see. I'm using sometimes Google Earth imagery. Sometimes I'm using photos that I took, or even like drawings that I did. Like these are a couple of drawings I did in Spain. Sometimes I am, like looking at different costumes, but then I'll usually actually get something. Like I bought a shirt to wear for reference for myself. And I also had a friend who was my reference for extreme facial angles for Katsa. She doesn't look exactly like Katsa, but she was close enough that it was really useful to be able to, look at her facial proportions, like when she's looking, straight up or looking really far down or off to the side. So that was super helpful. Let's see, looking at, historical costumes from different periods, looking at like archery poses, all this kind of stuff. I will sort of like fill up this notebook with things that like different haircuts for Katsa, different styles of armor, all this kind of stuff. Can keep it all in one place, nicely organized.
Okay, I had to unmute myself. That was so interesting. I hope I have some questions here. Who wants to raise your hand or post a question in the chat?
I see one in the chat that I want to pick up on.
Okay.
Yeah, JL Bell. I remember hearing Gareth speak years ago about creating part of Beowulf on actual wood. So it's fascinating to see him talk about using digital tools, exploiting both the strengths and weaknesses of those tools for his purposes. Yeah, that is the really key thing, is that each has its own strengths and weaknesses. And I love traditional materials, but the flexibility that you get from digital is sometimes pretty hard to pass up. And so, yeah, like Beowulf was all done completely traditional. The thumbnails for that are just little messy sketches. But then if I showed those to somebody else, nobody else could interpret them, right? They were really just for me. And then I would draw it bigger, and the whole middle section of Beowulf I painted on wood, which was actually really, really fun. And I would the biggest drawback to that was that I ended up with this giant stack of boards, that I was like, okay, I can't do a 200-page book like that, or I'll fill up my entire studio. But
I have a question,
Gibson.
Jenna.
Oh, okay. I thought Gibson first, so Gibson and then Lisa.
Lisa can go first. I'm still trying to figure out how to ask this.
Okay, Lisa first.
Okay, so my question is, when you are approaching adapting the classics versus something more contemporary, do you approach it differently in terms of how you think about the reader and also your responsibility towards the original text?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty similar, but there are definitely differences. So for one thing, I know that my text adaptation, I want it to be respectful in both cases, but in the case of the classic, nobody's, the author's not going to call me on it. Teachers might call me on it. So sometimes like I'll take out a scene and somebody will be like, oh my God, you took out that scene. I love teaching that scene. And my answer is always, like, I'm really sorry, but also you can still teach that scene. Like, the fact that it's not in the graphic novel is kind of interesting for discussion. With a contemporary book, there's really a back and forth with the author. And so on the one hand, I wanted to be extra respectful of her characters and the voice and not sort of going too far from her vision, but also I knew that she would pull me back in if I did. Like if I wrote something for Katsa that wasn't right, she would correct it. So it was nice. And I will say that it really, part of the genesis of the book was our mutual admiration, respect, and trust. And so we were very, we were like, we trusted each other not to step on each other's toes. And that actually ended up working out really, really well. I don't know if it would always be like that. So.
All right, Gibson.
Sorry. Let me add one more thing. And then in terms of the reader, with my classics, initially, I was just thinking of myself. I was basically doing the book for myself. But then I started thinking in terms of students and teachers. And with this book, I was really kind of thinking in terms of the fans, the fan base. Like, are they, I want to make sure these characters are like very cool, very attractive, that people are going to like really have fun sort of watching them play out this story. It was just a slightly different notion of the audience, and also that they were probably, a lot of them were actually going to be adults, even though this is YA, and hopefully we're going to get a whole new crop of teenagers reading it. I knew that her existing fan base are now adults. So.
All right, Gibson, your turn.
I hope I get this out the way that I wanted to. Is there a point when you're adapting works, either a classic or something more contemporary, where you feel that you have taken some ownership of it and it becomes yours as well as the original authors, or do you always kind of feel like you're a little bit inside somebody's house while they're not home?
I mean, yes and yes. I am always sort of here. So when I was doing the Iliad, I had at one point a chance to have a conversation with a guy who's a Homeric scholar, and I was like, "Hey, what do you think about some of these things that I'm doing with this story?" And he was like, "Well, you're part of the Homeric tradition. Like you're one of these bards retelling the Iliad, basically." And so on the one hand, that gives me a lot of permission. Like I can do that. I can do whatever I want with it in theory, but also I am part of that tradition. I don't want to be like disrespectful of that or be turning it into something that it's not, is the way I usually think of it. And of course, that Hollywoodizing it is another way to say that, because Hollywood is so often guilty of turning things into what they're not. But
is there, like, how often do you find things that for your interpretation you have to go against the original a little bit, and like how much struggle do you have? Did you say, screw it, it's mine now?
Yeah, I mean, there always are things like that. Well, sometimes you have to kind of like do some permutations to get what you want. So for example, in the Odyssey, I had this very clear idea in my head of what I wanted Odysseus to look like. And for some reason in my head, he's got white hair. But then of course we see him younger. And so I'm like, well, then is his hair black and it gradually sort of turns white? That's going to be kind of a shocking contrast, because we're used to seeing him with white hair at the beginning, because the beginning it's the present day, and then we see him in flashback, right? And so I ended up giving him this sort of sandy brown hair so that it wouldn't be a super shocking change. But then also I had to sort of figure out, well, like, when does his hair turn white? And I ended up deciding that actually there was a point in the story where I could actually legitimately have his hair turn white, which is when he comes back from the land of the dead. Now his hair is white. And so I was pleased with that solution ultimately, but like for a while there, I was like, geez, why have I, should I just get rid of this idea that he has white hair? Like, cause that's kind of silly.
All right, thanks very much.
All right, Lex, I see that you have your hand up.
Yes, Gareth, this is a great presentation. So much good process stuff. I had a question regarding going back to the discussion about the epics, and in your work with, epic poetry is like one of the earliest forms of entertainment, and in my experience, it always seems very visual, like those images just sort of crystalline in your head as you're reading it. And so you're taking those and you're adapting them into a hyper new context of graphic novels. And I just wanted to know if, in your experience, if you found those connected, and the way that perhaps you took some of that language and turned it into imagery, and what their process for that was like.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit different depending on what you're talking about. So like with Beowulf, I found that, there's all this amazing imagery that I could just basically take out all those words and show you pictures instead. And there's also a lot of repetition. So there's a lot of stuff I could cut out just because it was repeated. And the text in Beowulf, I treated it kind of as these large chunks. Like I present the text in boxes rather than in speech balloons, because it's like very declamatory and very, oratorial, and also a lot, and there's a lot of like narration at the beginning about, where did Beowulf come from and all this stuff. And so so then when I started working with Shakespeare, it was kind of like it was like a shock, because I was like, oh wait, that is not going to work here. I needed to be able to break it up into smaller chunks and put it in speech balloons, and of course, it's all dialogue driven. Shakespeare is, and in fact, when there is a stage direction, it just says like they fight, and suddenly that's 3 or 4 pages I have to allocate to that one line of text. Not that I resent that, because I love drawing fight scenes, one of my favorite things. But so that was a little bit different. And then I went back to like to Homer, and Homer it's a little bit in between. It's like it is much more dialogue driven than Beowulf, but there are these long explanations and metaphors, and so I was looking for something kind of in between. And with the Odyssey, I actually tried, I didn't use any narration in the Odyssey, and I found that I was able to mostly do what I wanted to do with the images. But then for the Iliad, I actually found that I did need to use narration, because there was so much additional information that was carried sort of in that text channel that I couldn't just explain it visually. And so there's, and like those wonderful metaphors, I also wanted to keep some of those in, because it's like, again, talking to some of these Homeric scholars, and they're like, oh, well, one of the, interesting things about the Iliad is like, they were trying to explain what war was like to some people who'd never gone off to war. So they use all these farming metaphors. And so I was like, oh, I really want to keep that sense in the book. So that was another reason why I ended up using narration. But yeah, it's a little bit different problem every time.
That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes. Oh, okay. I saw Patrick first and then Bob.
Thanks, Gareth. This is really inspiring. Great info. I want to kind of just jump, really kind of get a little granular with InDesign, if you'll forgive me.
Sure.
Are you, let me get this straight. Are you taking like your script and importing it, placing it into InDesign, and then are you using that as like a continuous thread for your lettering and your narration?
Yeah, so I bring the text in, I sort of plop it next to the page in large chunks that I think might be about 2 pages at a time. And then I grab pieces of it and copy and paste them onto the page in sort of random locations, but knowing, oh, maybe there's going to be like 5 or 6 chunks of text per page, something like that. And then once I start drawing, then I'm moving that text around and deciding, things that I can take out or things I might want to break up. But that's the initial stage.
And then so you're taking like those the breakdowns that you've drawn in vector, you're exporting them maybe into a PDF, doing the art, and then dropping that back into their own frames, or Something
Yeah,
like-
the exact way that I bring the sketch out of the computer is a little different every time, and it's something I'm constantly fiddling with because it's tricky. Typically, like what I did with Graceling is I printed those rough layouts out on the back of watercolor paper, and then I threw it on a light table. So I could turn on the light table and I could see this, and of course I flipped them. I printed them out reversed. And so then I could draw over that and I could watercolor over that. Sometimes sometimes I'll do like the really old fashioned thing where I print it out, I put like carbon paper under it and like transfer it to the paper. Sometimes I will do the drawing digitally, print it out on the front of the watercolor paper and just paint right over it. Now the trick there is that you have inkjet printers are either dye-based, which means the ink will run when you paint over it, or they're pigment-based, which won't run, but will slightly repel the watercolor. So I found that like for Romeo and Juliet, I did all that way. And I found that what I needed to do is kind of scrub the page a little bit with a sponge first before I painted on it. But yeah, there's like a million ways to tackle that problem, which are various levels of satisfying or difficult.
Great. And last thing, like, what was your first like, in my experience, not a lot of people just go to Indesign for experimenting. So like, what was that first project that made you say, oh, I'll use this way?
It was, so I sort of had a transitional project, which was Merchant of Venice, where I had started drawing little thumbnails on paper. And then I was working with an editor at that point, and they were like, I need to be able to read the text. I need the sketches to be a little cleaner. And so I started redrawing those sketches in Photoshop and then putting the text over them in InDesign. And then it was kind of like, well, I wonder if I could just draw this with this freehand pencil tool. And then I was like, oh, this is magic. Great. And I will just say, since we're talking, since we're down in the nuts and bolts, I mentioned that the files get very large. And so I will break the book up into like maybe 5 sections, because I find that it will, it'll get up to maybe like 300 or 400 megabytes, and then the computer will start choking on it. And at one point, the Odyssey got so bad that like I had to basically literally export everything as JPEGs and bring it back into a new document, which is not what I wanted to do, and I never want to do that. So I keep it in sections. And then I created a new document where I bring in all the text, and then I place all the finished art into that document.
Okay, so that was my last question: is the same InDesign document that you're starting with the same one that you're like exporting as a final PDF for publication, or is there?
So yes and no, right? Like I will have to do that process where I'll strip out the vector art and replace it with the finished art, but it is the same document in the sense that, yeah, I have all the text, laid out exactly where I want, and that file goes to the publisher, and then they do the part where they, there's a whole thing where it has to be repaginated in order to show up correctly on the printing sheets, and that's something the publisher handles. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm done.
Oh,
Cool.
I love that in the weeds question. That was great. All right, Bob.
I don't have any in the weeds questions, but thank you for that beautiful presentation, Gareth. That was wonderful. That
You're
was,
welcome.
I just love the behind the scenes, seeing somebody's process. It's such a gift. So thank you.
You're welcome.
One question, I have 2 questions, but one is just really stupid. I think we met a long time ago have you ever been in Boston at
Yes.
Fable Vision during a Christmas party?
Yes.
And you showed me your book, and I'm like, who is this guy? You like opened it up and showed me the illustrations. I was like, Ralph Cramden, like Hamana Hamana, it's like looking at these things. And I'm pretty sure that was you.
Yeah.
So you were at a Christmas party in like 90X.
90 something, yes.
With that gigantic book. And it was the Odyssey. So it had to be you. So anyway, thank you. So
Yeah.
we met.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, Fable Vision was a super cool place. I actually met those guys through my wife,
Yeah.
and that's the other thing I'll say is that it does help to have a spouse who's also in the business. And a few of those, like that Gifts from the Gods project, sort of came out of a connection that was through my wife, because she's a buyer, and so she knows a lot of the people in the industry as well, including Peter and Paul Reynolds, who are the Fablevision guys.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
there it is. Yeah, so there's my answer. Thank
Oh,
you.
that was
And
your
the
whole
second question
question,
is,
though?
There's a part 2.
it was a total fan question. I met you. But the other question was, that presentation just made me think, and it's always in the back of my mind, and I always think of production, but you're doing all these classics, but you've totally got the chops to do production design for a movie or a series. Have you ever wanted to do a script or think in that way, where you can bring to life visually a script that somebody brings you? Did you ever think of that? That's all I was curious about.
Yeah.
Because the presentation, just the way you organized everything, put the characters together and the story, it just looked like a fit for that. So.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. And I did at one point, when I was working in video games in the late 90s, I did try to pursue some Hollywood work, and I didn't get much traction on that. And I don't know if it was just, wrong place, I didn't know the right people, whatever. I will say that now a lot of those production artists, those concept artists, they're doing these digital paintings that are insanely detailed. And I'm actually not sure I could compete with that, but in terms of like storyboarding or something like that, that's still something I would be interested in doing. But my one time that I tried to get into it didn't really happen. So I was just like, okay, books is where I live.
Gareth, could you say anything about what you're working on now? Do you already have your next project?
So I'm in a weird place right now, actually. I'm trying to, so the book that I'm getting the most requests for is the Aeneid. And I don't know how marketable that is, but like, I'm probably going to do the Aeneid at some point. But I didn't want to jump right into it because I had just done 270-page books. And so I gave myself most of the year off, and I was trying to work on some picture book projects and some shorter stuff. And none of that stuff has clicked in yet as far as being under contract. So I basically am right now at the point where I have to kind of like fish or cut bait. I need to either like go ahead and sign up another big graphic novel, which is probably the Aeneid, or just say, hey, you know what, I'm going to keep pushing on some of these shorter things until they happen for another couple of months or whatever. Luckily, I mean, the blessing is that my books have stayed in print, and some of them have done well enough that that I don't have to like immediately run out and sign the next contract. And that's an amazing place to be. But it's also it's a little bit dangerous, because it means that, I can get distracted by other stuff, and I can end up spending a week working on house projects or, whatever it is. And then I'm like, oh, Jesus, I really should have been working on a book this whole time. So there's a little bit less like fire under my butt right now. So that's the trade-off. But
Samantha, you haven't asked a question yet. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you noticed anything in particular as far as marketing, and maybe it didn't feel like marketing at the time, but for example, I noticed when you talked about the first time you noticed that English teachers were really interested in Beowulf, and then I noticed that a lot of your projects after that continued along the kind of projects that English teachers would like. Do you have a specific audience, or do you know?
Yeah. So when
what
I realized that teachers wanted this, that they wanted these graphic novels as tools for the classroom, that I continued doing that, both because it felt good and because I liked doing it, and because I knew there was a market for it, and that was important. I didn't necessarily pick the right projects. Like King Lear and the Merchant of Venice did not do well at all. And indeed, my Shakespeare books in general have sort of underperformed what I thought that they would do. So again, you never really know. But yeah, so there's like picking what you're doing, and then there's social media, which you decide how much time and you see how good you are at it. The answer for me is not very good, so I don't spend that much time at it. But I do put, I keep it active. I do enough to sort of have there be a reason for people to look at it, even though I don't have a ton of followers. And then there's things like hiring publicists. I hired a freelance publicist for the Iliad. That was the only time I did that. It was a big financial investment, but I think it paid off. I think I got a ton of press for that book. And when I was self-publishing, I would actually buy ads. And so again, it was very important to know who my customer was. So I would get more traction from an ad in something like the English Journal than I would get from just taking out an ad in a comic book magazine or Diamond's catalog or something like that. But the other thing that's hard about marketing is you don't really know what moves the needle. Like sometimes the needle moves and you don't know if it's what you did or not.
Don, I think you raised your hand, didn't you?
Thanks, Jana, and thanks. It's been a while since we saw you. It was really, really enjoyable. I just felt, I wondered what teeth meant on your spreadsheet, and then you explained, but we have the NHS, very fortunately, in Scotland and England as well, although it's under threat. Did you not have some kind of insurance, or is that one of the downsides of being a cartoonist?
I did have medical insurance, and it turns out that dental implants are mostly excluded from both health insurance and dental insurance. And so certain parts like the prosthetic teeth that go onto implants, those are covered, but the implants themselves were mostly not. And so I ended up, I would say the whole thing was maybe covered, maybe like 40% of it was covered by insurance, but I ended up having to pay like 60% of it.
Was this a martial arts injury?
No, it was just a weird like medical thing. Like I just had from an early age, I had gum disease that didn't respond to conventional treatments. Luckily, I have never had a really bad martial arts injury, but I didn't, my nose is crooked. That's from martial arts, but.
Well, it's lovely to see you. I think we met in 1998 at SPF.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. Do you remember your first book? We still have your first book. Very enjoyable talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's one question in the chat from J.L. Bell who asked, did this financial approach come from having worked in the gaming industry, or did it come naturally to you?
It's not specifically about the gaming industry, although I did learn a little bit about, like I saw that these giant projects were, every project had multiple spreadsheets that somebody was building that had to do with, costs and burn rate and schedules and all that stuff. And that again, it was like this attempt to control this very chaotic process. But also I would just say that I'm actually pretty left-brained for an artist. So I graduated from Parsons School of Design, but I actually did my first 2 years at RIT. And I went to RIT because I was like, I think I want to study art, but also I'm kind of interested in engineering. And if the art thing seems like it's not working out, or maybe like if I'm not good enough, or maybe I'm so good that I don't need the classes, then I might switch into an engineering program. And then I very quickly realized that neither of those things was true. Like I was good enough, but I still needed a lot of, training. And so then I switched to Parsons. But yeah, I've always had a kind of a little bit of a scientific bent.
Cool. Lex, you have your hand up.
Yeah, actually, John brought up your martial arts, and I was just curious, because I know you studied for years, and how perhaps that has informed your artwork. If you see connections between martial arts and creation, and philosophically or physically, whatever you can speak to.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of things. So one thing is that, it was a good like stress reliever. It kept me fit. It kept me leaving the office when I was in the game industry. So many of you probably have day jobs, and I always think that these days, they would just want to keep you at the office as long as you'll stay there. And so it's really good to have a thing that you're like, I have to leave on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 5:30 to get to my martial arts class. It's really good for that. And then, philosophically, I don't know, I think it gives me a little more focus, a little more patience. And then it also definitely plays into the choreography piece. Like I just love choreographing these action scenes because, well, I've always loved that even before I really was studying martial arts, but that just shows you that I was always interested in martial arts.
So what martial art?
Oh, so I currently practice Aikido. I have a black belt in Aikido. In the past, I've practiced Kung Fu, Karate, a little bit of Jiu-Jitsu, a little bit of Kendo, Tai Chi.
What Kung Fu?
Northern Shaolin.
So wait, were you also a student of Shi Yanming?
No, my teacher, his name was Jean Duteau. This was when I was at RIT. It was like one of the clubs there. And then when I went to New York, I actually, I studied a little bit under Alan Lee, and then I switched to Aikido at a certain point.
All right, more granular details. Thanks.
I should wrap it up now because I'm actually supposed to be on another call.
Oh,
But this was so great, Gareth. Thank you so much. Can everybody unmute yourself and say thank you? We'll be posting the replay instead of Kids Comics Unite, and go out and buy Gareth's books. If there's any, Gareth, is there anywhere you want people to connect with you?
oh, I mean, you know, my website, my social media. I mean, it's all linked from my website, I guess. So go there. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth.
Thanks, Gareth. It was nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.